Good afternoon, good evening, no matter where it is you're tuning in from. Thank you so much. This is the future of transit bus service in the United States. I am your host, Brian Anselin, and we are presented today in cooperation with FleetMotum and the Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development at DePaul University in cooperation with the Transportation Research Forum's Chicago chapter. The Chaddick Institute for Metropolitan Development at DePaul University is a leading platform and forum bringing together and educating people on public policy, public transportation, and infrastructure issues. We are joined by Dr. Joe Schriederman, the director. FleetMotum is another presenting sponsor of today's session. FleetMotum is a transportation consultancy specializing in alternative fuel and electric fuel bus fleet integration, as well as tech innovation for mobility services. We're joined by David Hall, managing partner. And today's session, we are focusing on 5 things. What is the data telling us regarding ridership and revenue? How has the frontline adapted to changes caused by COVID-19? How are they dealing with the unknowns? What's the effect on public and private partners? And what have our operator panelists learned in the process, and how is that affecting their outlook moving forward? With that, I'd like to introduce each one of our speakers. First, we have Adelee Legrand. She is the Vice President for Strategic Advisory for Transdev North America. Transdev is the largest provider of multiple modes in North America, including bus, paratransit, BRT, streetcar, ferry, coach, shuttle, and microtransit. They serve over 200 communities with over 200 million annual passenger trips and operate in major cities and suburban areas, including New Orleans, Detroit, Phoenix, and the New York City suburbs. Our next speaker is Dan Hibbert. Dan is the Division Chief for the Division of Transit Services for the Montgomery County, Maryland Department of Transportation. The Montgomery County Department of Transportation transit service is branded as Ride On, and Ride On serves Montgomery County, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C., with a fleet of 375 buses using diesel, CNG, and electric power. They employ 650 operators and serve a community of 1.1 million people by operating 81 fixed routes and a microtransit service. They are soon to launch the first BRT service in Maryland. Our next speaker is Naomi Klein. Naomi is the Director of Transportation Planning for the Westchester County Department of Planning. The transit system for Westchester County, New York is the B-Line system. The B-Line system is the second largest bus system in New York State, serving Westchester County, New York, and New York City. B-Line operates 325 buses over 59 routes, connecting to the New York City subway system and Metro-North Railroad. They serve over 26 million riders per year pre-COVID-19. Next, we have Ryan Ruehle, Rapid Transit Corridor Planner for Pace Suburban Bus. Pace Suburban is one of 3 Chicago area transit operators serving 284 municipalities of northeastern Illinois, including Chicago. Pace operates 810 vehicles and 1,316 paratransit vehicles on 210 fixed routes, 50 dial-a-ride services, and 10 on-demand services. They transport 130,000 passenger trips daily pre-COVID. And last but certainly not least is Steve Brown. Steve is the project manager at HNTB. HNTB Corporation is an employee-owned infrastructure firm serving public and private owners and contractors. Founded in 1914, it is currently employee-owned with over 5,000 employees across 100 offices around the United States. Thank you so much for all of our panelists here joining us to share their knowledge. And with that, Steve, take it away. We have your presentation up here and talking more about ridership and revenues from across the US and the data that you have.
Great. So I'm going to keep it pretty high level and try to get through my piece of this pretty quickly to leave plenty of room for the other panelists. This presentation is one I've given before and probably one I'll give again as the data is still rolling in real time. And if you could go to the next slide,
Definitely.
I'll drop in a quick plug that I am giving a longer version of this presentation a week from Friday at Transport Chicago, which is one of my favorite conferences. Those of you who are either in Chicago or interested in Chicago, check it out, transportchicago.org. The conference is online this year, as I'm sure you can imagine. It is also free this year. So those of you AICPs looking to bulk up on credits, you can get quite a few of them in one day. So just wanted to drop that plug. Let's get into the findings. So first we're going to talk about ridership, then we'll talk about revenue just a little bit, and then I'll pass the ball off to the other panelists. Let's go to the next slide. So no surprise to any of our panelists or probably most of our audience members that transit ridership kind of went off a cliff in the spring of this year. Ridership on a monthly basis tended to bottom out in April. That's because the lockdowns kind of started in the middle of March. So the first half of the month people were out there and the second half of the month they weren't, and everybody was home in April. I should mention, by the way, most of this data comes from the National Transit Database from the FTA, and there's a few other sources that I mix in as well. Actually, if you could just go back for one more second, Brian. So the first slide here shows it by mode, and then we'll talk a little bit about different urbanized areas. The big top line finding by mode is rail was hit significantly harder than bus, and this is one of those first insights about how people are using transit differently during the pandemic. Rail, particularly commuter rail, bottomed out at like a 90% year-over-year drop in ridership, whereas bus comparatively was somewhat more resilient and has recovered faster. So nationally, bus ridership is now as of the late summer, down by about half compared to pre-COVID, whereas rail is still down 80 to 90%. Looking at, next slide, looking at urbanized areas. So you know, in transit in the United States, there's New York and there's everybody else, just in terms of magnitude. So I do show the New York region separately. This would include the suburbs. So I know we've got Beeline on the panel today. I believe this would include your system as well, because this is all by urbanized area. Again, the biggest urbanized areas saw the biggest drops. And I think this correlates to the fact that those are the areas that have rail service. If we could go to the next slide. Same information here, but this pink background kind of shows the range of year-over-year change just among the top 15 urbanized areas. As of the end of the summer, DC is down the most. New York has begun to recover. And regions like Houston and Miami that are much more bus focused are comparatively doing better than some of those biggest urbanized areas. Next slide. So thinking that there was a correlation here with by mode, this is the same information by urbanized area, but only for bus modes. And this is all bus modes. So regular buses, trolley buses, BRT, all of those different modes that are reported by the NTD. And you can see it as a very different story. So when you take rail out of the picture, New York's actually doing pretty well. The other really interesting finding here is just how bunched up the different urbanized areas are. Once you take rail out of the picture, whether you're talking the biggest transit market in the country, New York, or any of the top 100 systems, which brings you all the way down to the Des Moines and Kansas cities of the world, everybody's experiencing it pretty similarly. And I think that's a really interesting finding, not just initially, but also in terms of how the recovery has been going. Next slide, please. Just again, showing the range among urbanized areas. Again, even when you take rail out, DC is still down quite a bit, San Francisco region, and New York and Miami are now only down about a third from pre-COVID. Next slide. So what I show here is just a little bit of a regional perspective. This is Chicago versus the national trend. And I show this for two reasons. One, we have much fresher data for Chicago than the National Transit Database. So this is all the way through September. And also because Chicago has two distinct bus systems, one of which is represented on our panel. And there's an interesting finding here that Pace Bus, which is shown kind of the hollow pink line at the top versus CTA bus, there has been a distinct difference. That PACE bus is doing about 10% better than CTA, and I would hypothesize this has a lot to do with the markets that are served. PACE doesn't carry as many people as the CTA does, but it does tend to carry people who are much more dependent on transit, and people who are continuing to commute by transit even in the depths of the pandemic, versus more of your choice downtown riders who are working from home. Likewise, with the rail modes, both commuter rail and urban heavy rail, you can see the solid lines represent Chicago, the dashed lines represent the national trend. We're doing very similarly in Chicago compared to the nation. But the other thing that's interesting here is we had a big dip in the spring. Things came back in the summer a little bit. It hasn't moved much since July. And I think that is an interesting foretelling of what we have ahead of us over the next 6, 12, maybe 18 months. Next slide. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about ridership. I think we'll hear more interesting findings from our panelists about their individual systems. Let's talk revenue really quick, and then I'm going to pass it off. So first of all, fare revenue, as most of you probably know, fare revenue is not the majority source of operating revenue for most transit agencies, but it's not nothing either. Nationally, it's about 30% of operating budgets. The chart on the screen here, again, this is Chicago, just because this is data that is readily available. This is dashboarded on our RTA website, by the way, in case anybody's interested in digging into it. Transit agencies, by and large, stopped collecting fares entirely in the spring. And so you see things really bottoming out, almost 100% drop in fare revenue. The only exception is the CTA, and that's because they have turnstiles and we're continuing to collect fares passively through those turnstiles throughout. But even still, with ridership way down and no enforcement, fare revenue is way, way, way down. We've seen, particularly with PACE, as fare collection has resumed, that revenues have come back. But again, we're down more than half. And half of 30% of an operating budget is a pretty big hit. And so, we would expect, at least for bus modes, that this will track with ridership. It's a little more complicated with rail. You can see our commuter rail system, Metra, is still down over 90%, and that's largely because conductors are not walking the trains right now. And so fares are simply not being collected. Next slide. So 30% nationally comes from fares. The other 70% for most agencies comes from some form of taxation, by far sales tax being the most common nationally source of revenue for transit. When we did this presentation earlier, we were still more in the depths. We have started to see more of a V-shaped recovery now, and I think a lot of economists have actually been surprised how quickly sales taxes are coming back. But even now, August, we're still well behind the previous year, whereas normally we would have probably been forecasting growth of 2, 5, or 10%. We're instead still down. Next slide. Oh, I should have mentioned on that past slide, that's 3 example cities, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston. Again, we're kind of cherry picking where we can get really fresh data, and these are agencies that report it on a monthly basis. Next slide. So what happens next? This slide is courtesy of the Tax Policy Center, and what it's showing really is fiscal year revenue projections specifically for sales and income taxes, and the picture is not great. Although we've seen month-over-month recovery, fiscal year 21 is probably going to be really challenging, in large part just because the pandemic hit fairly late in fiscal year 20 for most agencies. And so they had pretty good, robust revenue collection for a while before things went off the cliff. FY21, if the recovery remains slow, it's actually likely that fiscal year 21 will be harder than fiscal year 20 for a lot of agencies. So this graph on the screen shows sales and income tax. There is a bullet on the left here talking about property tax, which is fairly common, especially for smaller transit agencies, particularly in the middle of the country. Property tax is a little bit more of a complicated issue, much more of a lagging indicator. And on that one, I would say we really have no idea yet what the impact is going to be. So that's the big picture. As I said, this is a presentation I'll probably give again. Maybe you'll see me again. We're going to keep reaching out to transit agencies and try to sort of dashboard some of this information so we can track it in real time. The next question is really going to be about Are the changes that transit agencies are making on the fly right now, are some of those changes going to become permanent? And what will the impact be to major capital programs, especially those that have dedicated funding or had dedicated funding before the pandemic that may now be threatened? So I'll stop there and turn it over to the rest of the group.
Steve, thank you so much for those really very, very eye-opening insights, and definitely important just to have that data and that conversation live on, and also to continue as we get more information, have a more clearer picture of what's going on in the industry and how we can really plan moving forward. With that, I'd love to throw to Joe Schwiedeman, who's going to take us and start with our panel discussion. So Joe.
Oh, thank you, Brian. I think the first question I wanted to ask is what, kind of field operation, we'll pose this to Ryan first at Pace Suburban Bus. And what specific field operation service policy changes have you implemented because of the pandemic? And how has that affected your ability to meet your service standards? Give us a little detail on what's happening in the field.
Sure. So one of the things that Steve mentioned, Pace did suspend collecting fares this past March through May. That was also partly done to help avoid contact with the operators and, prevent the spread of COVID-19. It also allowed rear door boarding policy for our larger 40-foot vehicles that have the rear doors on them. And, just in general, it kind of felt like the right thing to do, as so many people have lost income or jobs, and thus our service has really been a lifeline for a lot of those folks in getting groceries and medical trips and that kind of thing. We also have temporarily suspended or reduced service on nearly 100 of our 210 routes where ridership had either completely or nearly disappeared. So that's a pretty big impact. Some of the equipment that we were able to free up, though, from those service changes, we've used to reallocate along our heavy hitter type routes. And that's been done to ensure social distancing aboard those vehicles. And then we can avoid, max loads of 15 or more in that way. Regarding the service standards, so Pace is currently working on developing a formal service standards framework, and that'll be partly addressed with the forthcoming strategic vision plan that I mentioned before. In the meantime, we have performance standards that focus a little bit more narrowly on things like on-time performance, productivity, fare box recovery, etc. So clearly, many, if not most, of our routes are not meeting those standards at present. But the timing is actually somewhat fortuitous for us, since it kind of gives us the ability to have a fresh look at what we want a more formal set of service standards to achieve as we get further into the development of that. And the other thing too is it's an opportunity for us to kind of reset with an intermediate reduction of service, which kind of helps with a more clean slate approach with a longer term restructuring of our network. And that's also, as it would be, another initiative of our strategic vision plan and what we're calling for.
Very intriguing how you're rethinking those standards, on the fly here as we get new information. It's great to hear. Anybody care to augment that? Some things you're doing at other agencies?
Well, certainly in Montgomery County, in March, we started out with rear door boarding. We actually have installed flexible vinyl barriers in the front of the buses to protect the operators. We also now have masks available. We started this back in March. We provide a free mask for all of our customers. So we kind of went aggressively at trying to keep the buses clean with twice-a-day cleanings. We did have to modify our service schedule. Obviously, some of our lower performing routes, the headways, we used to keep no more than a 30-minute headway. Well, we were at 45 and 50 on some of those routes. But that seemed to work well. The good news is we've seen a continual growth in ridership. We've got all of our routes back and running now. And so the demand is out there. And I think as we continue to put service out there, we'll make adjustments. And just like Pace, we also create a strategic bus plan so that to reduce crowding on buses. But even still, it's a challenge because some of our routes, they're just loading on and we have to get another bus out there in time.
Boy, like the old airline shuttles of years ago where you just see how many show up and you find another plane. It's like that with a bus.
Exactly.
One more answer if anybody cares to chime in on that. If not, we'll go to our next question. David, you want to take it away there?
Yeah, the next question is, we saw the stats from Steve and how the ridership's been impacted terribly. My question is, did you see shifting in routes? Did you see, ridership down 90% on one route, but not down near as much on other routes? My question is for Naomi.
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, we have a bunch of routes that connect to the Metro North Railroad, and those we've seen plummet. They're maybe at about 20% now, or even less than that. Some of them have no ridership at all. But then our core routes that connect the Bronx up, say, to Yonkers and White Plains, they have a much higher ridership, and those are a lot of people going to service jobs, a lot of low-income people. About 63% of our ridership in total is transit dependent. They don't have access to cars. So we've definitely seen huge decreases on the services that connect to the railroad. And we're really watching that. We think, I mean, a lot of it is because a lot of those people, they're telecommuting, and the people in the service industries are not. I should say too, though, that a lot of these trends that we're seeing in ridership were happening before the pandemic started. I think people know that 2013 was a peak for bus ridership around the country. Just with Beeline, we carried 33 million that year. And in 2019, pre-COVID, we were at just about 26 million. And there were other trends going on, the rise in e-commerce, and that's been exacerbated too with the virus. People shopping from home, so that increases traffic, it slows down buses, it takes people out of buses that worked in those stores, takes people out of buses that went shopping. So those were some of the trends that we were seeing before, and even telecommuting. But that, I think the telecommuting is really the unknown, and how much that is going to gain in popularity. I think businesses are already saying, a lot of them, that people are not going to be coming back to offices. They save money that way. And a lot of employees really like it because they have better quality of life. They save money on travel. They have more time with their families. So there's a lot of trends that were happening before the virus, and we're monitoring all of this very closely as part of our service planning efforts.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating. So kind of a time of day shift on some of the routes, less commuting, more just general mobility, and like you said, for service
Yeah,
workers.
well, I think you know, for the bus routes that connect to Metro North, I mean, I think eventually New York City is resilient. It's going to come back. The theaters are going to open. The museums are going to open. The discretionary ridership, I think, will likely come back. But I think the telecommuting is going to have long-lasting effects certainly on our bus routes that connect to them. And so, and for the first time, nobody ever imagined this happening, that we would have near empty commuter rail parking lots. And for the longest time, there was always a lot of pressure to build more parking to accommodate increases in ridership. So I think it's just going to be really interesting and something we have to monitor.
Yeah, absolutely. Adelee, have you seen similar shifts in time and shifts in routes as Naomi has?
So thank you for reaching out or asking me the question, David, because I was going to raise my hand to comment on Naomi's points. And they're very relevant. I would say, as a planner, and thank you, Steve, I will attend the conference so I can get some points there. But as a planner, typically when we design schedules, we're looking at the home-based work trip. And I do agree that the future is going to be home-based other. And, you know, Naomi, you're spot on. This has been going on prior to COVID. At Transdev, we've been running economic analyses to really determine what was going on with the ridership. And we saw that once, you know, if we had a low unemployment rate, then we also saw that our ridership was kind of connected to well, right? Because if people had jobs and they were working, saw one type of travel pattern versus when people were unemployed or underemployed, it was different, right? So that's not rocket science. But then once we delved into the data, we started to see that also telecommuting was, you know, a sector that really wasn't being analyzed heavily. And what was missing from some of that data as far as the ridership was how many people were telecommuting. And again, this is before COVID. Now, post-COVID, what we're seeing, and across many, you know, systems, since Transdev operates many systems, you know, we're seeing from the customer's perspective, you know, through customer surveys, that there are a couple of things that they're not really interested in going back to. So one, customers didn't really care for being in crowded vehicles prior to COVID. They did it because they didn't have a choice. But the reality is, even if, you know, we get out of, when we get out of this COVID period, people are, at least in their survey responses, are reluctant to be in close confined spaces with strangers. So that's one thing. So that means for a transit agency's perspective, what is our fleet size going to look like? You know, how much spacing are we going to still feel like we should, you know, provide just to keep the customer satisfied? And then again, what's the cost of increasing your fleet to move pretty much the same demand? So that would be one. And then two, it's time of day. So if people are not commuting to go to work and back home, but they're taking these other trips, you know, our models really aren't really built and designed to focus on that home-based other trip. And that's really what we're starting to delve into. You know, where are people going? What time of day? How far are they making these trips? What mode is the best mode to carry them from a transit agency's perspective, especially if the demand isn't as concentrated as it was when you're doing a home-based work type of pattern. And then lastly, I would say that what we're seeing is there really is an increased use in other modes. And when I say other modes, I'm talking about bicycles, scooters, walking. We're really seeing more people are choosing to do that. So much so that you see people, especially on bicycles, on sidewalks where they do not belong, but you recognize that they are not, you know, professional bicycle riders. So they're trying it out and they're on the sidewalk. But what that means is that transit agencies really have to figure out a better way of integrating those other modes. Outside of having a bike rack on a bus, I think we need to think broader about how we integrate bicycles and scooters into our overall system to continue to attract people for those other type of trips. So I would say those are the highlights that, you know, we've seen thus far.
Yeah, intriguing about that typical commute pattern. We're so used to building transit around, how almost every social force we see makes that less common. You know, work from home, telecommuting, the kind of riders that are using transit more during the pandemic tend to have service jobs, which are different. Which leads to my next question, just about the uncertainty. You know, with all the uncertainty in the air about ridership, when it's going to return to pre-pandemic levels. I mean, it's just nobody knows. How are you and your team approaching the potential service cuts or reallocation of service capacity, given all this uncertainty about what's going to come next? Anybody care to dive in on that one?
Sure. This is
Sure.
Naomi. I want to say a few things. We're very cautious about it. You know, as I said, we don't want to take away service from the people that really need it the most. And we don't want to reduce the amount of service on certain routes and then there'll be a lot of overcrowding. We're really monitoring our loads very, very carefully. And I think we all have an obligation. This was brought up recently by Adelee, just the issue of people feeling safe. I think we really have an obligation to convey the message that transit is essentially safe. And there was recently a study that came out by Sam Schwartz Consulting that said that if people are wearing masks, if there is adequate feeding and ventilation, that the risk of contracting COVID in a transit vehicle is minimal. And I think initially we were putting lots and lots of emphasis on extra cleaning. We're doing that, but I think now we really have a lot more information and we know that this is airborne and masks can really protect people. And we find that there's a lot of peer pressure and people want to wear the mask. We really haven't had an issue with compliance. So, you know, we're proceeding cautiously. I have to say another factor has to do with colleges and universities. About 10% of our ridership is students. And that ridership, I have to say, has plummeted because of remote learning. And the other issue is enrollments being down. We really don't know whether students are going to be not going back, taking time off because they don't want to enroll and because they don't want the remote experience. And we don't know yet about how much remote learning is going to continue versus in-person learning. So there's a lot of factors coming together. And I should say we're also, as a lot of the other agencies, we're in the middle of a bus redesign and really trying to figure out, well, what is the role of fixed route transit? How can we be flexible? Where do we need to have micro transit, more on-demand services? So there's a lot of things coming together at once here.
Yeah, intriguing. Ryan or Dan, either of you want to comment on that?
Well, certainly in Montgomery County, we actually started up a microtransit program last year, and it was growing by leaps and bounds, which unfortunately the COVID experience we had to shut it down. The other interesting thing is Kids Ride Free in Montgomery County. We're one of the second largest organization in the country that provides free transit for kids under the 18 and under. And that doubled in less than a couple of weeks. Kids were riding everywhere, which was kind of fun for me because those are new customers in my view. And realistically, the challenge is going to become when schools are going to go back in session at some point. Will all the kids ride the same buses? Maybe not. Will all the buses be able to handle it? Maybe not. So it's an anticipation that we're trying to figure out how to deal with if we have a lot more kids riding our system, which we encourage. One other thing I didn't mention is we won't start collecting fares until we have permanent barriers around the bus operator installed. And we got on the bandwagon quick back in April and May and started making our orders. So we hope to have all of our buses with bus operator enclosures by January. So then we can start collecting fares. But revenue has gone down, and the county itself is struggling as well as all other counties across the country because revenue has gone down. So we're trying to figure out how to make it work within our own budgets and some constraints.
Ryan, any thoughts?
Yeah, so Dan mentioned micromobility, which is one of the things that we were looking at previously with the development of our plan, our strategic plan before COVID hit. And I think that in general, a lot of the things that we were looking at before have only accelerated, which I think Naomi was also referring to, specifically with when it comes to coverage-based service. Our service area that we provide service to is predominantly lower density. It's a lot of the suburban communities outside of Chicago. So we have a lot of legacy service that was kind of left behind that we absorbed previously that's been difficult to know what to do with or how to change it. So I think in general, a lot of those services where we haven't seen much productivity, we're trying to shift towards those more coverage-based services, micromobility pilots, more demand response type services. So I think that's something that we'll look into a lot more. And then with a lot of the freed resources that we have, using those to kind of build up our more expressway-based services, bus rapid transit-like services, and a lot of the more key corridor markets where we're seeing a lot more growth and a lot more sustainability in terms of ridership.
Yeah, well, that's one fascinating thing about this. It's also true in higher ed that all the political log jams that existed to try new things have kind of plummeted, you know, working with micromobility, thinking outside the box. So I mean, window to try some of those things, both Dan and Ryan and Noah pointed that. David, do you want to take us on our next question, which relates to that?
Sure, my next question will be for Adelee. Because you mentioned in your intro that you were looking towards the future and the forward. I mean, COVID's been extraordinary circumstance across the transportation space. Hopefully we've learned some things from adjusting our routes, et cetera. How are we going to take those learnings to help us go forward?
That's a great question, David. So what I would say is, you know, it's all about supply and demand, right? And sometimes we lose sight of why we're doing what we do. And, you know, the economy plays a large role in the supply and demand elements associated with public mobility. So really, in order for us to have a real handle on what the future looks like, we have to understand what our economic base is going to look like. You know, a lot of the public transit riders were people who were dependent on transit in one way or the other. Either it was because of your income or the distance from where you live to your job. But either way, you were dependent on this mode because it was the most affordable or the fastest way for you to get from home to work. As we mentioned in the last, you know, several answers to the questions, you know, that is changing. And in addition to people telecommuting more, a lot of the frontline workers, the essential workers, you know, if those jobs are starting to, you know, get smaller, I would say, because of online ordering and online buying, you know, we're also going to see an impact as it relates to some of our core transit riders. So what does that mean? One, are they going to be able to afford where they're living currently? Two, if not, where are they going to relocate? And as planners, you know, we're not psychic, but we have to really look into the future and understand land use and the land value and start to determine where people will start to move to in order to still maintain, you know, close to a similar standard of life and find additional employment that will allow them to afford to live in those locations. In doing so, that means that now we're starting to look probably at a larger area of service coverage. And then again, applying or providing service in areas where we currently weren't, or if we were, it wasn't as frequent as we did in the past. So, we can all agree that, most corridors that have high density, heavy demand, you'll see very reliable, frequent service. And then you have those other areas where you have to provide service because it's in your service area, but there isn't a whole lot of demand, but you have to put service out there to meet those needs. The questions that we're asking as a team is, are some of those areas, those outlier areas, are those going to become more dense? Are more people going to start moving out to those locations because they're more affordable? But then as the economy changes, they'll be further away from work. So those are some of the conversations that we're having right now. Also trying to understand what is the best way to meet the demand. Again, we know those routes that go far out once every hour. That's not very efficient. No one's really happy about that kind of coverage. So, is it better for us to really start looking at other modes like microtransit, some sort of on-demand, partnering with third-party providers or TNCs? It's really looking at the whole, I hate to use this planning term, but toolbox of options to really figure out what's the best way to serve the community. Lastly, I would say that a lot of the work really has to go to talking to the community. That's who we're providing the service for. We're not just doing this to run our models and our, analyses. It's really to find out, one, the community that you're serving, what is going on with them? How are they being impacted economically? Do they have to move from where they are? What kind of coverage will they need? And then where are they trying to go? In the past, maybe they were going to work. Maybe now they have to go to a food bank. Do we have service that takes people to food banks? So those are some of the questions that we're going through and, really trying to address so that we can start planning for what the future may look like.
Wow, Adelee, that was incredible. It really was. A lot of thought-provoking stuff in there, really. I mean, the shifting of demographics and good stuff. Naomi, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I want to echo a lot of the sentiments that Adelee shared. I think she explained it quite well. And here in the New York region, we've seen about 500,000 people already leave New York City. And right now there's very low housing inventory up here in Westchester County. People are moving here right after we thought, the trend was that the millennial generation wanted to be in cities, didn't want to come to the suburbs. So it's really hard to tell where that trend is going to go and to what extent. Also, just the changes in the economy. We have this gig economy, this idea of people working anywhere, anytime. We saw this pre-COVID, lots of shift work. So that really is something we have to consider in our transit planning. We have to really think about what will the residential preferences be for people and what's going to happen. We're already seeing vacant shopping malls. Are we going to now have a lot of vacant office space? How are we going to redevelop that? What will the land uses be? So I think it behooves us, as I mentioned, we're also undertaking a whole mobility and bus redesign study, really looking at scenario planning, I think is really important. Say, what if we had to contract 20%, or what if we had to cut, but then reinvest in something else like micro mobility or on-demand service. So we really need to be cognizant of all these factors, but unfortunately, nobody has a crystal ball.
Wow. Dan, I'd like your thoughts too. I mean, you're launching BRT next week. Exciting. Yes. Did anything we've learned over the last 6 months kind of guide us with that launch?
Well, certainly in the preparation for building a BRT program from scratch, we actually went out to the neighborhoods, trying to figure out how can we make this work well for the neighborhoods. And we had a lot of community input, and we designed a program so that we would make sure that we actually put the BRT where people live and where people would get access to the system. Our challenge is it's a very congested corridor. Fortunately, we have a bus on shoulder for about 40% of the service, which keeps our speeds up, because obviously speed and frequency make a world of difference. But we actually are exploring it using microtransit to support the BRT program. There's a lot of areas where we could reach out and with a smaller vehicle, get a lot more people into the system. And I think that's where we're looking at Montgomery County as a way of making microtransit a much more viable part of our program, because realistically, we need to get out into areas where transit has never been, because I think people will start to use it if they see it's an opportunity and an option.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating, really is. The microtransit obviously is coming out as a theme here.
It's quite frankly been the customers have liked it. We've designed it so the buses are lift-equipped buses. They're smaller number of passengers, but quite frankly, the customers get to know the system real well. And they're used to the Uber Lyft concept, but we put actually fare boxes in our microtransit buses. So it's like a regular bus, just a little bit smaller, and we're doing, we're picking up in the neighborhoods. We're not doing door to door or curb to curb, but we're actually intersection to intersection. And it's worked out very well, supporting the bigger systems.
That's intriguing how, co-branding and everything else creates a sense of cohesion in people's minds, that they're thinking of microtransit and buses in a sort of similar philosophical sense. That's cool. I'd like to shift a little bit, but it's very much related. Our last question for go to audience Q&A is, what during the pandemic has changed about public-private partnerships for agencies with regard to bus operations? I know we have some bus operators on the line here. They're in a very uncertain place. What's changed about how you work with private operators? And anybody can jump right in.
Well, this is Naomi. I mean, we worked very closely with our operators, especially in the early days. It was really a partnership when they had a lot of absenteeism because of the virus, and really working with them carefully and strategically on how we had to reduce the number of trips to allow some semblance of some social distancing, and also to be able to provide a certain amount of coverage. But we haven't really looked at changing anything else, but I would say it's a partnership.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I'll say for PACE, we have a lot of private contractors that operate our services as well. Everything from our paratransit service to some of our on-demand and dial ride services that are more township-based, as well as some of the other fixed route services too. The other thing that comes to my mind when I hear the term public-private partnership is some of the sponsorship that we get from a lot of the businesses that we might provide service to. Specifically in our area, there's the Lake Cook Road Corridor right at the boundary between Cook County and Lake County, where we have a lot of corporate headquartered businesses out there. But as some of the other panelists have mentioned, the loss of office workers due to remote work really kind of raises the question of what the future of some of those partnerships might be. And then the other thing that's kind of happening simultaneously in our region, being that Chicago is kind of the center of a freight network for the country, we've seen, I would call it, like an explosion of industrial logistic distribution center type development, particularly along the edge of the metropolitan area in southern Cook and Will counties. There's a lot of jobs to be had there for a lot of workers. It is, places like Amazon, their distribution centers, entire campuses around some of the railroad terminals where there's just building after building, these gigantic facilities. So, but given the fact that they're so far away, I do kind of wonder if that's one of the next things that we'll see in terms of public-private partnerships, in terms of, getting some funding to provide service out to those areas.
Yeah, I'll just add that it's astounding, like some of the Amazon warehouses with a couple thousand workers in one spot. I mean, that's a fair amount of density there. Great comments. Adelee, you're a big player in this world. So how's the thinking on your end with this private partnership plan?
So what I would say is just to share how things have really become different. We have had clients, especially in the beginning, in the earlier days of COVID, instead of, having to take clients, passengers to, let's say, the grocery store, especially before we were told that masks were the way to go, or, we were still in that nebulous space. We didn't really know what exactly to do, and people were concerned. We actually were picking up groceries from the grocery stores and dropping them off at the client's location instead of picking the clients up and taking them to the grocery store and then having someone pick them up and bring them back home. So, I would say that's a little creative. Definitely, it was not something that we did prior, But it was something, one, focusing on safety, and it's the same trip, right? The person would have gotten in the paratransit vehicle and gone to the grocery store, and someone would have picked them up. Let's figure out a way to make it a little safer. So I would say during this period of time, we've really thought, out of the box and work closely as partners to really find the best solution for the right problem. So we'll see, hopefully as time progresses, we'll continue to be super creative and figure out the best way to move forward as well.
Definitely, and this is definitely a time where we all have to be creative in order to survive. So this was a really, really incredible insight from all of our panels. So thank you so much. From here, we're going to go to our audience Q&A, and we have quite a good variety of topics here. We'll try to answer Alan's questions first, and he's asking about operators' experience with single payment systems, and if you've been able to adjust fares depending on time of day or on weekends. So Dan, we'd love to hear from you first about payments, what you think about your experience either running with a payment plan or looking at adjusting fares to generate more ridership.
Well, here in the Washington, D.C. region, we're tied into the Smart Trip program, but we haven't collected fares since March. WMATA intends to start collecting fares in January, and we do as well once we have our barriers in place. And we're going to move forward with that process.
Wonderful. And Adelee, obviously Transdev does quite a few different arrangements with different agencies. So what's been your experience working with different payment options and also looking at more of a scale tiered version of fare collection?
So fare collection is very difficult and complicated. So I would hate to give a response that makes it seem like it's very simple. You have to do fare equity analyses. There's a lot that you have to do before you can restructure fares. But as far as collecting, of course, during COVID, there was a period of time where many clients were not charging a fare and allowing passengers to board from the rear of the vehicle just to keep the operator safe. There are also been, conversations about going cashless. Those of us who've been in this space for a while, this is not a new conversation. People have been talking about this for a while, but the whole equity piece. What I would say is COVID is an interesting animal because, we can all attest that a lot of places that we used to shop prior to COVID, you could pay with cash and they all have big signs up that says, no cash accepted. So what does that mean for, the protected classes? What does it mean for equity analyses associated with fares and moving forward? I think someone asked the question, are some of the changes that we've made during COVID, how will they remain post-COVID? And I think that's something that we're really going to have to tackle and understand what we will be permitted to do. As far as having one single, platform for payment, yes, definitely that is something that I personally would advocate for, but again, the question is it going to be equitable? Will all of our customers be able to access it? And to me, that's the biggest challenge. And once we get that resolved and figure out a way to ensure that everyone has access, the technology exists for us to have everything on one platform. It can also be designed so that it's based on the user's preference. So you have your own profile and you can choose which modes you want to use at what time. And you can put all your fare payments in an app and you can, pay as you get on the vehicle. So that part is not the difficult part. It's all the other stuff, the policy stuff and, the regulations, and then also supporting the community. Again, as I say frequently, it's really about understanding your community and ensuring that you're not making changes that are going to negatively impact them. And I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in the fare conversation.
Definitely. And Ryan, we'll also love to hear from you about this. Pace Suburban is a really large network. So how have you and your team been able to look at the fare collection, fare strategy situation?
Well, it's something that we're still looking at in terms of, COVID-19 and what we do going forward. I will say, though, with the Ventra system that all three service boards are using now, that's really been kind of a game changer for us. I know the mobile app is on its way, or if not, it's already in effect. And that's a good way to deal with the crisis here, not having to actually give a ticket to a metro conductor or something like that. But yeah, in general, the venture system's been great, and I think it'll be a good asset for us going forward as we figure out what to do.
Definitely. And next question we have is from Dick Mudge, and his question is for Naomi. And Naomi, you mentioned about the upcoming redesign for the Beeline system in Westchester County, New York. What is that looking like? Is it more of realignment of routes and vehicles and resources to different areas based on ridership shifts, or is it more of an encompassing, okay, we're going to implement a BRT and look at different other types of technology, including the planning part?
I guess I could say in a way all of the above, but I think Ryan talked about it earlier, his bus redesign, and it's the same approach for us, really looking at the county as a clean slate from the ground up, figuring out what are the travel markets, and then really what is the best way to serve those markets. Is it with a fixed route service, or is it with something else where, say, there might be not as much a volume or low density development, and another form of mobility of service is appropriate, like micro mobility, on demand service, as we said. And we don't have any expectations in keeping with how these kinds of studies are done as far as what % of the system has to change or not change. As far as BRT goes, we did a BRT study a number of years ago, and we implemented signal priority in one corridor from the Bronx up to White Plains. We had a real issue dealing with putting in a bus lane because of we didn't have control over the roadway, and the municipalities, we had a real issue with giving up parking for a bus lane. So we didn't do it. But in a way, we're kind of getting away from the term of it BRT, but just really trying to make our buses move faster. I think people know buses are essentially slow. They lose time as people board and alight. They lose time at traffic lights. We want to do what we can to improve them. We're looking at a lot of things, just things like stop spacing and balancing bus stops better. And in some areas, signal priority, or a lot of the bus routes in Westchester County, almost all of them, they were former trolley lines. And a lot of them, they were operated privately, and many of them are just way too long. We have routes that are 2 hours, that take 2 hours, so they're just subject to more delays. So it's really an analysis of what we're doing and really looking at new ways of providing services.
That's a really wonderful way to conclude our session today, since we're at time. But this has been a really, really incredible conversation, and I really appreciate each one of our panelists and co-hosts today for contributing and also for sharing your incredible insight. I hope that this was as informative for you as it was for our audience, and for myself as both a transit professional and also someone who has a great appreciation for transit itself. So thank you all so much for joining us. If you did register online and for the event, you will get a link in the follow-up email to both the recording and also links for each of our speakers, so you can connect with them on LinkedIn. So again, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us, and thank you all for tuning in and for your incredible questions. So thank you so much, and I'm sure this is not the last time we're all going to meet. Until next time, have a good afternoon, good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.